All right, folks. It's 4 o'clock. Thanks for stopping by my talk here. The title is a little bit scandalous. It's meant to be controversial. A lot of folks are investing a lot of money in security technologies, and my job today is actually to eviscerate the entire security community, which I kind of live in and influence. And I'm going to do it for a really important reason. So hopefully you can get past the snarkiness. My general social approach is to be really flippant, so I'm going to do that. Hopefully that makes this entertaining and not a little uncomfortable, but it's meant to generate discussion. So that's really where I hope this goes. We're going to talk about who I am. I'm going to give you my manifesto, which I posted to Twitter just the other day. I'm going to take some super cheap shots at some very common security technologies that you should all be familiar with. I'm then going to walk through the attack lifecycle for targeted intrusions, and we're going to point out some ways that we can be improving security through review of that threat model, which is only one of many models. We're also going to look at some case studies that illustrate my central premise, which is that these passive security devices by themselves are not sufficient to protect our environments. Though I will point out as a kind of a pacifying control that they're all really necessary anyway, and I'm going to explain why. And then finally, I'm going to walk through some recommendations, some things that organizations can do to prepare themselves for the inevitability of one of these types of compromises, and hopefully leave enough time for you guys all to interrogate me, but please be gentle because I'm soft. So myself, I'm a 315er. Please no one boo. I grew up in Ontario County, and I was a student here for a number of years. My background is informed by systems administration. As a teenager, I inherited a number of Linux systems that I maintained painfully through the 90s. So this was before modern package management. This was before you could really easily compile kernels. This was all very painful. And as a result, I found myself with a career, but I didn't really know that. No one really told me in the late 90s that being a sysadmin was a thing. I grew up in a rural community, so there wasn't anybody to give me that perspective. I was also a network engineer for a really long time. I spent about 15 years in Rochester as a sysadmin and network engineer, working for data centers, working for telecommunications companies, working for ISPs, working for academic institutions. And I feel like that was a really formative part of my career. In fact, when I talk about sysadmins later in this talk, I'm going to explain why they're really great incident responders and why they should be tapped for those roles. Now, since 2011, I've been with a security company called Mandiant, recently acquired by FireEye a few years ago, where I've been leading investigations. If a major intrusion investigation associated with like a nation state or financially motivated actor added a year to your life, I would be about a century and a half old. So it's a lot of different investigations, a lot of different verticals, from defense, engineering, financial institutions, academic institutions, healthcare, and Rocky was kind enough to actually tee up a couple of the investigations I've led in the last 3 years. So although I won't tell you which ones they were, some of those have been very high-profile investigations where a substantial amount was invested in security and a substantial amount of security failed. So I feel like the two talks actually dovetail really nicely. Now I also teach. I teach incident response, but I've also spoken really prolifically about some of these computer network exploitation techniques, leveraging things like WMI, PowerShell, and other native frameworks. I've spoken at length about building incident response programs, so feel free to use some of that supplemental material as you're going out and looking for additional sources of information to build your own programs. And I've teed up some of those presentations, so when I release these slides later, you're welcome to go out and look at some of those other talks. Some of them are interesting, others a little less so. And occasionally I tweet at people, and that has mixed success. So this is my manifesto. This is really what it is. So incident response is a human task. It is absolutely a task for people. You cannot trust a machine to do incident response for a lot of reasons. We also want to make sure that we acknowledge that incidents will wrap up. We will end the response cycle. we should begin preparing for the next one immediately. We should always assume there is a next one. Many of the organizations that I've dealt with that have been compromised and re-compromised felt they were one and done. Oh yeah, we had a breach. Yep, okay, we had outputs from that. Cool. We made a lot of changes. Now we're good. And that is a very dangerous place to be. We also want to avoid becoming reliant on technology to do these things for us. I think a lot of organizations buy the boxes. They buy the big shiny box. They spend $1 million on boxes. And they're like, cool, response done. I got a machine. Definitely not going to go find a qualified candidate to become part of my program and be responsible for machine herding, for driving the program forward. And when you invest in boxes, they will let you down. Boxes are actually really bad at incident response. And I'm going to point out some of the ways that boxes are really pretty bad at incident response. So intrusions happen, attacks succeed, and leadership is really the group that struggles most with this, because they're like, I spent $1 million in that box. I spent $1 million. We had a breach. We had an investigation. We learned things. Why did I get recompromised? I felt like, from a business risk perspective, we were good, but because they're buying boxes and not necessarily hiring qualified people, they're not getting the message. They're not being educated properly. And so this is really a problem that we create in our industry, the fact that you can buy a box and the box solves problems. And it's also one that we are prepared and empowered to correct. So all of us, any organization we work for, we can correct this trajectory. This is within our power. And hopefully today you'll get some ammunition for that. So this is kind of where I begin talking about my cheap shots. I'm going to keep it really quick because this is the one that's most likely to be inflammatory. We have a saturated security ecosystem. There's all kinds of boxes. There's all kinds of tech out there. And those pieces definitely fulfill certain types of capabilities. So I thought I would define reactive or passive technologies. And in short, these are things that tell you about something that happens, but that's all they tell you. So if we look at some of these examples here, firewall. Firewall says, hey, a bad thing tried to happen. I left it in a half open state. That's a funny firewall joke. There's going to be a couple of these. Antivirus solutions. Hey, someone created something bad on this endpoint, so I deleted it. There's no longer evidence of the thing I got rid of. Oh, okay, yeah, that's very helpful. IDS, IPS. A bad thing attempted to happen or succeeded in happening, so I generated like 3,500 alerts. I hope that's cool. And so whitelisting's approach is like, hey, something tried to execute on this endpoint, and I'd never seen it before, which is the very definition of badness to whitelisting. So we're good, we're done. Multi-factor. It's like, hey, someone tried to log into this box, but they didn't supply me with a numeric code, so I ignored it, because that's bad. And then vulnerability scanners are like, I don't really know what bad is. Self-signed certs are pretty terrible, but like this remote code execution vulnerability, it's probably fine. So this is the way that some of these technologies perceive bad things. And so if we look at this as incident responders with our informed lens, this is a very different ecosystem because we approach these devices as sources of evidence. These devices do not care about evidence, and the evidence is all the context. So if we look at a firewall, hey, what around this event happened that might be relevant, whether it succeeded or failed? Because both criteria are incredibly important to us as responders. Maybe the firewall blocked a certain amount of traffic from a source IP address, but before it did that, it let through a whole lot of traffic that we're really interested in. Well, now I got to go interrogate the firewall to get that metadata, to begin informing myself about whether I need to do anything else. And because the technology blocks, but it doesn't answer questions about the context around it, again, that before and after, I might not be properly informed. So yeah, the firewall blocked something, cool, we're done. The firewall worked, it did its job. But I don't know about the jobs it failed to do. If we look at antivirus is everywhere. It's a necessary evil. We need to have antivirus everywhere. But let's say antivirus blocked something. Okay, cool, it did its job. I've got, Windows credentials editor, some random rat that's on a system. Antivirus caught it, deleted it. logged it. Okay, well, how did the attacker get into the environment? Did they get onto another system and then remotely interact with the target where this alert occurred? Well, I have to go investigate that. It didn't solve any problem. It blocked one thing, but it gave me no context around the larger intrusion. Now, I don't know where they came from. I don't know whether maybe the attacker unpacked the malicious thing from another thing that antivirus didn't think was that bad. Maybe the attacker downloaded some sort of archive, unpacked all their tools, which antivirus had never seen, very signature driven, and now I've got to go in and investigate that. So I've given myself an additional task because antivirus did its job. With IDS, IPS, no one looks at 3,500 alerts. I'm going to stop right there. Tuning those devices is really critical, and most organizations I deal with, and I've dealt with hundreds, they're not properly tuning any of this infrastructure from an IR perspective. So they don't look at it through the IR lens. They think, oh, I've got my IDS, I've got my SIM, they're collecting all this stuff. I don't know if I'm breached, so I don't know if I'm collecting the right stuff. And then after they learn the artifacts of a breach, they might tune it a little bit, they might get a little bit better, but that's an incremental change. So they don't substantially improve the reporting of those devices. And then whitelisting. Yeah, we don't know where the attacker came from. We don't know if this is admin misbehavior, like maybe the admin really did think Windows Credentials Header was the best way to reset a password. I've seen that. Maybe renaming a native Windows tool wasn't seen as really malicious, but whitelisting's like, I got a name mismatch. I gotta dig into this. I gotta register an alert. And then stuff like multi-factor. How common are these occurring? What's the frequency of occurrence of these events? The device doesn't know to report it. Again, this is kind of filling an investigative workflow, which is how I see these technologies succeeding, but that's not the way organizations are using them. Most of my clients, when they've dealt with this infrastructure, they put it in place and it's kind of set it and forget it. In fact, I've seen companies that were breached that fired a bunch of people who became experienced during the course of the intrusion, and then they came back later and got recompromised. They're like, I don't know how this happened. We spent $2 million on fancy boxes. I was like, yeah, well, you fired the 3 people who were most empowered to solve this problem for you. So it becomes really challenging. And as an investigator who sees the same organization recompromised multiple times, I consistently see the same issues. I see a lot of issues where folks are focusing on boxes, investment in infrastructure, and a lot of that, I think, is this concept that all advanced attacks require an advanced technological solution, where in reality, I think a lot of these require a human solution. Now, technology is crazy important. I don't want to understate the value of technology, but I want you to realize that technology solves only one problem for us. It fills that pipeline of things. It's a lead generation tool. It blocks a thing, it stops a thing, it alerts on a thing, and then we know that we have to go validate that activity. We have to begin kind of a mini response process. And for organizations that want to reduce false positives, they want to be able to manage these aspects of their vulnerability management program or their threat detection program, that's a lot of effort. And they're thinking about, hey, I need fewer people, more tech. And I'm going to flip that. I'm going to say you need more people and less technology. You need to get more bodies, especially experienced bodies. And as Rocky pointed out, experienced people, we're at negative unemployment. We have a 0% unemployment industry. The problem is, if you look at the most experienced people, those people are such high-value targets for every other company in the world. You're really facing crazy competition as a business. Very challenging to satisfy this. There's lots of ways that we can accomplish that, however. So this is where I pause, because I just kind of eviscerated the security industry. I don't think that this is necessarily a bad thing. I think that if we can acknowledge the role of technology in our security programs, we'll be better positioned to be successful. I don't think that means less investment. I don't think this necessarily means changing our approach to responding to threats, because we can have a really solid methodology and we can staff those differently. But hopefully through a review of this material, we get to a slightly better place. So let's call failure relative. All of these controls have a place. Firewalls, you need firewalls. I just read about a financial organization, $80 million because they didn't use firewalls. They routed stuff, but no firewall. So that's a pretty substantial misinvestment. That's one of those things where even a simple basic firewall would be better. But I also want to point out that not all threats are created equal. And this is because threat actors are learning from us. The more information that we put out there to benefit each other, to improve our own capabilities, we actually enable threat actors a little bit more. And some of the things we've observed as investigators around the world is threat actors are getting really clever. One, threat actors are moving away from compiled binaries. Now this is a deliberate move to avoid endpoint detection. So using interpreted scripts, whether that's VBScript, JScript, PowerShell, whatever it is, moving away from a compiled binary makes it substantially harder for whitelisting to be successful. Attackers have learned this because we keep talking about whitelisting. Things like using unique network indicators, unique IP addresses, fully qualified domain names for every victim org. That means that if you develop intelligence in your organization and you share it through a threat sharing group, threat actors know about this process. And so for every target, they create new NBIs. This makes it really hard to write signatures, especially if you've got a really simple detection framework. Now this doesn't necessarily apply to things like the C2 communication algorithm or ways that they're protecting, encoding, encryption, etc. That's a little bit different. This is just for those network indicators with no other context. They're compromising trusted infrastructure. I was talking with a couple students earlier. We've seen threat actors compromise organizations and use C2 through Google Code. We've seen it through Microsoft TechNet. We've seen it through other code sharing sites. We've seen GitHub abused for this purpose. These are things that your organization will whitelist because you're going to have developers that need access to them. You're going to have operations personnel that need access. You can't just block all traffic to those sites. And attackers have learned this through a painful trial and error process. And for us, it's harder to see that. But for them, they're attacking dozens of organizations at a time. And they're measuring their success and failure the same way that we might measure our success and failure on a single engagement. Because for them, those campaigns are one engagement. We're also seeing attackers go native, use almost entirely native frameworks, WMI, PowerShell. I've seen attackers exclusively use Samba client and LDAP client to manipulate systems in an environment. And if you permit this for legitimate purposes, attackers abuse that. And they also know how your systems work. I've seen attackers compromise SCCM because they know SCCM sometimes leverages WMI. They'll compromise the SCCM management account so that it looks even more like normal traffic. I've even seen them manipulate the names of those specific SCCM tasks so that when they're pushing out malware or performing credential harvesting, from a network perspective, from an SCCM server perspective, it looks completely legit. And unless you happen to be sitting in memory on the target systems, which isn't always practical, incredibly difficult to detect. So attackers are learning, and they're escalating on us. But if we keep relying on the same failed technology to solve all these problems, we're going to have a really bad time. And then I had the same Blade Runner quote down here as Rocky used, and I took it out while he was talking about the threat model process. But it applies. I mean, I've seen a lot of stuff. I've seen threat actors do some pretty crazy things. I've seen a lot of inventiveness and innovation. And I think that there are some ways that we can combat this. So if these technology solutions don't solve a problem for us, if these are not black and white prevention and detection, well, what good are they? And the first thing is they save us time and money. They catch some of that low-hanging fruit. They block some things that allow us to detect. They satisfy those requirements, and they do a pretty good job at it if we put them in place in a layered approach. We also have to realize that a preventative control is a detective control. If the firewall blocks something, it's detected something. It's given me a source of evidence to go query. It's given me a notion that something went bump in the night, and that allows me to mobilize myself, to bring a whole team together, pulling together multiple sources of evidence from multiple different systems, hopefully to put together a picture of what occurred. And maybe at that point, I'm done. I stand down because there's nothing detected. There's nothing serious going on. Maybe it is, in fact, a false positive, and what I've learned is I need to tune a solution. Or maybe what I've done is I've detected the early salvo in what's about to be a much larger compromise. So being prepared definitely helps us. It also allows us to extend our capabilities into environments where a single person just simply does not have the bandwidth. I've done investigations of 100,000 endpoint environments, 250,000 endpoint environments. If it was just me, that would take forever. Just me with scripts, that's a whole lifetime to get the details I need. If I leverage tech in these different locations, these different regions, I can extend my capability, multiplex my data collection and analysis approach. And we'll talk a little bit about some of the ways that we can use automation to kind of solve that problem. And Rocky brought up compliance. Compliance is kind of an ugly word. Compliance is really important. Mostly because if you're in an industry that regulates data and you're a custodian of that data, you are beholden to those checkboxes. That is unfortunate. And I'll agree with Rocky again, that you can be in compliance and be insecure. But if you are secure, you very likely are also in compliance. It's about going above and beyond, using compliance as kind of the launch point. If you do detect intrusion, these technologies can be sources of evidence. Think about NetFlow metadata. It's not a PCAP. You can't parse out what really happened. But let's say you wanted to do statistical analysis of lateral movement. Well, NetFlow is great for that. You can keep NetFlow for 2 years. It takes no space at all. You can apply basic data science principles to it. Heck, you might want to make that part of your detection approach. Pro tip there. These are infrastructures that are already out there. We've already invested in them. Well, let's just co-opt them for our detection and response. Let's not wait for them to tell us about a bad thing. Let's see what they're already seeing that they're letting through. See if maybe we can manipulate that. And of course, blocking and tackling. These are basic security controls, but they give us a dialogue with leadership. And Rocky talked about metrics. I'm going to talk about metrics too. Metrics are huge. Metrics are the common language of business risk. If you are not reporting metrics on like at least a semi-annual basis, your leadership probably is not well informed. Now, it's impossible for us as folks on the ground to go to leadership and be like, hey, mandatory meeting, you gotta receive these metrics. Leadership has to be invested. But you're the best advocate for that because you actually understand what can happen if they're not informed. You can communicate to them. And using that common language of business risk, they can at the very least make a choice to be informed or uninformed. So, targeted intrusions, everybody talks about kill chain, everybody talks about our model. I like this model because it maps to human activity, because I can look at what a human does and I can craft this into a narrative. So this is pretty important, but what I'd like you to take away is the closer we get to initial compromise, the better we're getting. If you take nothing else away from this diagram, the closer you can get to day 0, the better you are. Now, chances are you're going to miss some things. Attackers are actually really versatile about how they compromise organizations. Most folks think it's just spear phishing or strategic web compromise or maybe like a web attack. I've seen threat actors compromise legitimate third parties that have persistent VPN tunnels. I've seen threat actors weaponize devices that were backdoored and then ship devices. The old USB in a parking lot trick. Yeah, it's a great trick because it works. I've seen cases where attackers have compromised network hardware and then put it up for sale, knowing that it would find its way into a target environment of interest. Now that is something that no organization could ever properly plan for. You can never just be like, well, we're going to just go direct to the manufacturer because maybe your budget doesn't allow that. Maybe you don't have that flexibility. So knowing that you're going to be compromised prepares you to try and find stuff early by looking frequently and having methodologies built around that technique.
Would you, in that case, would flashing the firmware on the device back to factory take care of that?
So flashing the firmware is a great option. But what if the device has multiple modules? Like look at a Cisco appliance where the network traffic module has its own entire subsystem. Well, you can totally flash the core device, and that's never going to touch those individual modules. You're going to have to go through a very painful process. And of course, you can go through that process and and still not be entirely confident that you were successful. So it's a little sticky. And that's why I say that it's not possible to have every contingency covered. If you assume you will be compromised, you will make better decisions about how you look for evil. And that's really what this is about, is making good decisions about finding evil. So I've got some really snarky case studies here. These are all from actual investigations. 2015, I had a client who pushed antivirus out to a group of domain controllers for the first time ever. These had been in production for years. They had always assumed antivirus would affect performance. They were actually right, but it was a bad decision not to push it, because a couple years prior, an attacker had dumped some software on these platforms, which antivirus found. It installed and started scanning, which is what antivirus does. Did its job, and it said, hey, I found this bad stuff. Now, as we did our investigation, we actually found out the attacker had been pretty active in the environment. Now, if this company had decided to deploy antivirus to these DCs as part of their normal rollout process, antivirus would have had the ability to inform them about the presence of this malicious software. And certainly they could have begun an incident response process. Because they forego that step, it put them in kind of an uncomfortable place. Now, this attacker was there for more than 14 months. That's a long time. You know, having antivirus as a common control, really important. Let me back up 1 second here. One of the interesting aspects of this, I almost skipped past it because it's kind of the core here. When they looked at the timelining around this and lateral movement to their DCs, they looked at their firewall logs and they thought, okay, well, one of our DCs was exposing RDP, maybe there's something related there. What they found is that there was a SQL injection attempt around the same time, and their firewall did in fact block it. However, about midway through, the attacker took over, and you could kind of tell the cadence of an automated SQL injection scan versus the manual probing. And those commands were base64 encoded, which, interestingly enough, the web app interpreted properly, but the firewall did not see that as a SQL injection attempt. I would name the vendor, but I'm pretty sure they would sue me. And this is one of those cases where, yeah, the firewall did its job. Somebody probably saw the alerts and thought nothing of it. We actually couldn't find a single person at the company who remembered reviewing those alerts or seeing those alerts. We didn't see a trouble ticket opened in their ticketing system. I think they used Remedy, went back like 2 years. Didn't see anything. So this is one of those cases where, oh, the firewall did its job and we're happy because it did its job. But if we'd only dug a little bit deeper, we would have started to see those base64 XP command shell references. We would have maybe seen some RFI attempts, gotten ourselves into that response process a little bit more fluidly. Now, firewalls do satisfy a lot of requirements. I'm going to call some of them out because I think firewalls are really important. We like our firewalls to digest some of these indicators. Like one of the features of a lot of these advanced firewalls is, oh, we have a threat feed. We'll tell you about bad stuff that we find. Things like things our customers share with us, or things that we digest from open source intelligence, things derived from malware analysis. Maybe we've got a whole business unit that does that. But firewalls also, miss quite a lot just because they don't give us that great context. So maybe our firewalls can look up things like trusted and untrusted C2. Maybe communication from you to Microsoft Update, we're going to call that trusted. Maybe connection to dynamic DNS resolved FQDNs are bad. Maybe we even want to apply something like trusted and untrusted web domains to our firewalls. These are all capabilities the firewall can apply that give us a good position, gives us a better position to detect malicious C2. But unfortunately, most firewalls don't do any kind of internal analysis. Even if you have an internal firewall, chances are you're not looking for things like lateral movement, RPC or DCOM, SOAP connections. Now, some of these are frustrated by the fact that SOAP connections are encrypted. But even non-encrypted traffic, something that's essentially like human readable, the firewall's not really looking at that. It's just essentially doing like IP configuration or network configuration rule setting. But the problem with firewalls is that when we write rules about threat activity, we are chasing a known threat. Like we write them as a response. We're not really writing them preemptively. This morning, Jared was talking about egress controls. I'm a big fan of egress controls. Firewalls that block outbound by default are huge. How many people think a server should initiate outbound connections from their enterprise at will to any fully qualified domain name? Oh, good. I saw no hands. Cool. You all passed. Passed the friendship test. We want to make sure that if we have stuff in our environment, it can't just get out to the internet, because that is like the #1 hallmark, an initiated connection from a server outbound to C2. That's a very bad thing. You'll have exceptions, and hopefully as you watch your environment over time, you'll be able to identify them preemptively. Put in those exceptions so that you can get out to Microsoft Update, that you can get out to the various infrastructure sites that are necessary to do your job. But I think a better solution would be set up a network specifically for that. And then because you've isolated it, you've given yourself an environment that's going to tell you about compromise. Because when those exceptions fail, that prevention turns into detection, and it allows you to act. So cool, firewall worked. But firewalls are fallible, and we want to keep that in mind. We want to be really focused on how limited a firewall is. Antivirus. Now, antivirus can have a lot of similar parallels here. In 2014, I had a client who wanted a compromise assessment. Compromise assessment is kind of like hiring me to be your internal security team to proactively identify threats, full disclosure. And what we found was a bunch of Derusby variants from about 2011. Well, that's interesting. Derusby, which we call Photo, is a pretty common malware family. We found a bunch of different variants in the environment. Each variant had its own MD5, its unique file name, its persistence mechanism was all done through search order hijacking, but the actual persistent binary names, were things that you might expect legitimate software to have. They'd done a little bit of studying, what's vulnerable to search order hijacking. They named their DLLs appropriately. And when folks looked at these systems for normal IT operations, they didn't notice anything weird. Now, unfortunately, this was detected through a compromise assessment, so we knew that they were owned. We were able to do an investigation to scope that compromise. AV had no ability to match on any of this metadata because it was all file-based. They even had a solution that claimed signatureless detection or heuristic detection, machine analysis, buzzword soup stuff. It did not work. Short story, it failed. Now, we never got an answer from the vendor about why it wasn't successful, but the bottom line here is we found malware in an environment for which there were no signatures, no functional signatures, though there have been signatures since. And while this remained undetected, the attacker had pretty much full reign of the environment. It was all installed in a privileged context. Now, AV is really super important. Having AV on everything, even Linux systems, even non-Windows systems, really important. Having AV on your phone could be super important. It's a computer. If I could get AV on my Apple Watch, I probably would. And the message to take away here is if commodity stuff is in your environment and is successful, targeted stuff will be successful. It will absolutely be successful. As a tool, antivirus, it's not going to scope an intrusion for you because attackers are going to use things that antivirus doesn't identify as malicious. Antivirus, like whitelisting, also succumbs to that blind spot when it comes to scripts or interpreted language because it doesn't know it's weird. It's never seen it before. It can't look at a script that has two forms of obfuscation and say, oh, well, clearly this is bad because I can't read it. It just passes. And so things like that put us at risk. The call came from inside the house. By the time AV tells you about something, you're already compromised. And at that point, it's really scoping your intrusion. Now, sometimes you get lucky. Sometimes during that initial phase, the attacker is using something old enough or obvious enough that antivirus does have the ability to detect it. But just because it succeeds in blocking the malware on one or two systems doesn't mean that antivirus was pushed everywhere. Maybe in your enterprise you have inconsistent deployment. So we still have to do an investigation. We still have to begin scoping that. IDS, IPS, and again, there's kind of like a repeated message here of blind spots that we need to be aware of. We had a client who came to us. They were concerned that other industry organizations were being targeted, and they said, hey, we want to know if that's us. Are we in this group too? And what was interesting is they were talking with some other companies that had been breached, And some of the indicators of a prior phishing campaign came up, and they're like, oh yeah, we remember that. We have some documentation on how we stopped that. Yeah, that sounds eerily similar, but we didn't think it was serious. We didn't know it was targeted. So we did like a mini investigation and cleaned up. And they actually did a really good job. I was impressed at their response process, but their IDS, IPS solution, it caught a lot of stuff that allowed them to scope infection, but it didn't catch anything related to lateral movement. In fact, on one system, the attacker had used RDP, terminal services, between two endpoints, and the IDS completely ignored that, even though one of the source systems was marked as infected. Because of that, the attacker had a foothold on a new system. They cleaned everything else up, and the attacker knew, haha, now I know I've got a foothold. They can catch my backdoors, but they don't see me on this one endpoint. So they deployed a web shell. This happened to be a DMZ system that was out of scope for IDS. And through that one web shell, they were able to remain persistent in the environment for over a year. So this is one of those cases where certain amounts of regulated data were at risk there, and that was not great for a certain regulatory body. So IDS IPS does a lot of things. It's pretty important for us. But one of the risks here is that the people who develop these technologies, they might not know what you know. They might not be investigators. They might be application authors. They might be folks with a computer science background who have had no formal security training. They might have never even heard of some of these scenarios. So how do they write a signature to detect it? How do they write language to express that? And the other thing is expression language is a function of the technology. You know, you can go to any IDS and write an alert. Well, if that expression language isn't sophisticated enough to document the things you care about, the things that you know are bad, well, you've got technology that's incapable of helping you. So you've got a huge blind spot. And that's where you have to rely on other technologies to help out. I think this is a comment that's attributed to Gus Grissom. This rocket was built by the lowest common denominator. I think 10 seconds later he was incinerated. IDS IPS solutions solve one problem for us. They don't solve all of our problems. I've actually had clients tell me, oh, I don't need to worry about this threat. Our IDS will catch that. I saw the signature. And then you have that conversation. You're like, well, what's the signature for? And they show you this thing that contains 4 IP addresses. And you kind of scratch your head because you're like, okay, well, what about all the other TTPs associated with this actor? Like, maybe the way they move laterally is really recognizable. We can get metadata from our environment that informs us about that. Maybe their mission objective tells us about the threat actor, and there's something that the IDS can capture that will help us, or maybe there's another associated system. But because the client had believed they were protected, they were actually unwilling to hear that they might miss something. It also forgets the fact that attackers evolve. Like, we look and say, oh, hey, this attacker, they tunneled RDP through a web shell. That's APT whoever. Okay, well, what if somebody else read the same report you did, and they decided to adopt that technique because they thought it was nifty or effective? Well, that's a case where the attacker has learned, and we're trying to play catch up. And then app whitelisting, and I actually can't knock app whitelisting, except we've had cases where attackers have used PowerShell scripts or used Windows scripting host's native ability to interpret JScript or VBScript, all of which you can, and I've seen backdoors written in. And app whitelisting completely ignores it because if you enable blocking of scripts, you break a lot of the sysadmin functions that are necessary for your business. And very rarely do folks go and audit the stuff that's allowed through app whitelisting. And both steps are really important. I want to be sensitive to time so I can take some questions, so I'm going to power through this. But if there's any questions about this particular slide, please let me know. Uh-oh, a thing happened. Come back. So we want to make sure that we understand the blind spots of our technologies, because the blind spots are actually as important, if not more so, than what the technology does for us. And I wanted to kind of end this section. I consider this a high note. Might be debatable. Vendors want you to believe that if you buy their box or their solution, you can live in a risk-free environment. You can live in a threat-free, wonderful utopia, and it's not a real place. It is a pleasant fiction, but it is still fiction. The most important thing that you can acknowledge now is that you will not find things you don't look for. These technologies are not the solution to that. However, we as human beings have the ability to leverage any tech in our environments, whether it's security tech, operational tech, logging infrastructure, data structures. These things are our tools, and we can build whatever we want with them. So it's actually cool. We're gonna go out into the Badlands, but it's fine because we have what nothing can be, what no technology can emulate. We have expertise. We have human beings who know stuff. And through expertise, we develop process and methodology. You can take an incident responder who's even been through a single incident, and they're going to know something more than maybe a person who's been, watching glass at a SOC. That person has an instructional opportunity, and we can build upon those to create efficiencies. We can make this a little bit easier. We can also track our success. Rocky talked about metrics. I love metrics. We want to focus on ways to quantify what we do. One, this gives us a common business language. We can go to leaders and we can educate them about what we've been doing and how we've been doing it and how we've improved over time. But it also gives us the opportunity to measure ourselves, to self-assess in a neutral way. Because if you're using some kind of color scale, some non-quantitative scale, like, oh, we went from orange to green, you have no idea if you've gotten better. You have no idea, and you have no way to estimate how much better you are. We also want to make sure that the experts who are doing the work are selecting the technologies. I've had managers come to me when I'm on an investigation, folks who represent leadership for my clients, and say, oh, well, we bought blah. I was like, oh, what's blah do? And they walk through this list of amazing buzzword soup, and I say, oh, well, did any of your team members select that technology? They're like, no, one of my buddies over at wherever we play golf said I should get it. I was like, wait, you just spent $200,000 on another shiny box. We don't know where it's going to fit in the ecosystem. We don't know what it's going to satisfy. But worse, we are now putting the weight of learning that technology and incorporating that technology on somebody who might already be overloaded. We might have a person who's already at the limit, and now we just dropped another task on them when they could be spending that time looking for more threats, scoping existing intrusion. And finally, we don't stop. We're never done. The job is never over, which is actually the great part about it, is because it doesn't necessarily matter if you improve during this incident. There's going to be another one. You're going to have another opportunity to get a little bit better. And if we're measuring our success, we're going to know how much better the next time around. So, takes a village. You got chocolate and my peanut butter. Red teaming is a huge boon for us, because people with an offensive mindset who have an experience compromising networks, they're going to understand attack methodology. They're going to be there to allow you to test your controls. But not just that, test your response process. It's the most important part. If you're just doing pen tests to find vulnerabilities, you're missing stuff. Because an attacker can leverage these native frameworks in your environment that leave very little forensic evidence. And if you're not looking for that in a controlled setting, well, you sure as heck are not going to find it in an uncontrolled setting. So getting these people on your teams, very, very useful. As a side note, sysadmins and investigators make awesome red teamers because they understand the outcomes of some of these different functions. And so they look at it objectively and they can say, oh, well, I found these things. Here's how I would clean up. Here's how I'd cover my trails. And then the red team say, oh, I learned a little something. But the blue teamer can then say, and here's how I'm going to preserve that evidence. So in case you try and delete it, I still have visibility. So it gives you a great control. Sysadmins make great red teamers. They have a security mindset kind of already. They understand what normal is, so abnormal to them is a thing they can key off of. And once you have teams built, they play off each other very nicely in a non-adversarial way. Bringing in an external party is another good option, but if you've already got expertise in-house, these are people who know the lay of the land. Let's harvest that. Let's harvest that knowledge, because the threat actors have to learn that. We've already got people who know it. Let's take advantage of that. Phase 2, process. So I started with people. Process is almost the most important part. You can live off the land. If you know which phases of the attack lifecycle leave artifacts and where, you can start to collect those things, analyze those things, and that's going to empower you to find future compromise. In fact, if you build methods around this approach, it's going to empower you much more than investing in some technical solution, buying another shiny box. Each one of these phases is important to a compromise. And in some cases, they're mandatory for the success of an intrusion. But it doesn't mean that you have to say, okay, well, we're going to start with initial compromise. We're going to just master detection of that. Really look at the entire life cycle. Look at it holistically and say, okay, well, what do we have for email logs? What do we have for process execution? Do we have the ability to collect shim cache from all Windows systems? Do we have Macs in the environment? Can we grab all launch daemons? How do we do that? What are the technical controls necessary to support this process? And of course, automation is one of the best ways to do this. Automation allows us to work at scale in an enterprise, to pull things back, but also to start running through common forms of analysis. So things like data analytics, which are mostly a function of statistics and math, we can automate that programmatically. Pull it back, stack it. Let a computer do that. That's not a human task. I want to look at the output of that. Look at that least frequency. Look at that most frequency. Look at things like least common substring for network activity. See, what does that mean for my environment? Am I finding things through these data science principles? Until you have the data, you actually can't apply that knowledge. And there's a human type of knowledge. A person can say, okay, shim cache. I see ds query, ds get, who am I? And I see something called wceaux.dll. Oh, geez. Windows Credentials Editor, Unpacked Library. I better investigate. And that's a human decision. Now, you could technically automate that very simple type of analysis, but maybe your sysadmins routinely run the same 3 Windows native commands, and suddenly you're starting to see other commands like Quinsta, query, queuser, things that your admins don't normally use. And you use that least frequency of occurrence to see, oh, that happened twice, that happened 4 times. Everything else like 30 or 40 or 500. Now I have something statistically significant to key off of, and it's a great way to start detecting. But again, you have to start getting the data first before you can apply some of this. And these are exercises that I recommend every organization practice. These are classic preventative containment operations. We want to practice blocking an IP address, validating that blocking it was successful. Use a dummy IP, doesn't matter. Make sure you can do it and capture metrics about how long it took. You want to know what that's going to be like, because when you're fighting fire, this is a really important step. Sinkholing DNS records. Setting that to localhost or some catch-all bit bucket, wherever you want it to be, practice it, test it. How long does it take you to update those TTLs? Like, is that really short? Is it really long? What's your process? Is your DNS internal? Is it external? Do you have to contact a third party? Do you have an SLA? These are really important questions when you're dealing with a nation state that's stealing data. So you want to be able to contain. Contain a system that's infected. Take a system that's infected. Maybe you don't know how it's infected yet, but you want to make sure that beaconing stops. You want to know how long it's going to take to get that. Maybe you've got offices out in the middle of the woods. Maybe you've got sites with no operations personnel. What's your plan for that contingency? How do you address that? Because again, if an attacker has a foothold and you can't get somebody out to that site, maybe it's a trailer in South Dakota, it's going to take an hour to get somebody out there. What are your options? Because if you don't know what they are, you're going to be in a bad place when there's an intrusion. Be able to go through all of your sources of evidence for some of these common indicators like IP addresses or DNS records. Have the data in one place and practice doing queries. This is a thing that you should do periodically, but especially as your organization changes, as you absorb new entities, as you change personnel size. These are exclusion criteria for some of these tasks to be successful. So we want to make sure that we test against them. Match up a DHCP lease to a system. Like, take a DHCP record and go back a certain amount of time. Be able to match them up. Because again, it's a really important task. If you can't go back in time to find some of these workstations that are infected, that means they're going to come back on the network. And you may not have visibility where they come back. Maybe things like VPN split tunneling works against you in this case. And so you want to know, you want to have a contingency for that event. Frequency of occurrence of IP addresses. If it happens all the time, if it's happening on a routine schedule, well, that might be beaconing. That might be a thing you want to look at. So apply that knowledge to the data you've collected. Do an audit of accounts with multi-factor access. Look specifically for accounts that are in PIN or token-only mode. Disable these accounts if you can, but check to see which ones have been changed and how recently. See if that is an active token account, because we've seen attackers compromise two-factor solutions. It's actually not hard. If you've got access to a two-factor solution and it's a domain joined system, pretty easy to compromise. Even things like exportable machine certs, pretty easy to get out, even though they're marked as non-exportable. Plenty of tools that'll facilitate that for you. We also want to make sure that we have the ability to do an enterprise password reset. It's the number one thing that I recommend to my clients because it's the most painful. You've got 10,000 service and application accounts. Those are in scope. Have a plan. Consider changes to your Active Directory environment that facilitate it. And of course, be able to look at systems where your critical data is, because if you don't know where it is, if I say, hey, laptop X has been popped, what's on it? And they're like, oh, I don't know, I don't even know who John Smith is. Pretty sure he works here, he's got a laptop. Well, that's not a great place to be in, especially if John Smith is responsible for, say, all your social media accounts. Or maybe John Smith is the guy who manages RSA. Maybe John Smith is the guy who is the gateway to your accounting system, and he is capable of executing ACH transfers. All these things are really bad things to not know. So start answering those questions now before you're breached. And of course, technology. Most organizations have firewalls. They have web proxies that have some kind of click-through. They're going to have the ability to implement multi-factor. These are all very common technological controls, and they all have value, but they don't by themselves answer the question of, have I contained an incident? Have I detected everything? Have I scoped it? All they really do is fill that investigative pipeline. We also want to focus on things like the ability, the technological ability to reach out to systems to pull back artifacts. Because if we can't get those answers very quickly, we're not going to know what the significance of an event is. We might not be able to detect if something's a false positive for maybe hours while an attacker has a foothold on a system, while we're desperately trying to call somebody to get us logs or get us the contents of a directory. That's a very painful place to be. And kind of like my capstone here is, technology is where we end. But we start with people first, people who know things, and we allow those people to develop methods and processes, because that's really the value of incident response. Those are the things that detect and prevent compromise. And you're never going to prevent compromise entirely. It's a myth. I've entertained it many times. I think it's kind of a nice fiction. But I think if we can get very close to initial compromise and we can get answers from these systems quickly, we're going to be in a much better place to respond. Cool. And now you guys have heard me shoot my mouth off. I encourage you to ask questions.
The second to last slide, you had listed some tools there in the upper right corner.
Yeah. So I'm a big fan of Kansa. Kansa, written by Dave Hull, formerly of Microsoft, I believe, and John Turner. Kansa is PowerShell and WMI based. There are a lot of risks associated with opening that up, and just like Rocky suggested, I would say set aside a proxy or VLAN where those requests are allowed to come from and they're blocked from everywhere else. I really like GRR. Power Forensics is developed very recently. I think that's Jared Atkinson, primarily the developer there. But Power Forensics is really cool because it allows you to, at scale, leverage the PowerShell capabilities of every endpoint. What's kind of interesting about these frameworks is they look a lot like attack frameworks. If you think about the way they're structured, they're module-based. They allow us to remotely access systems. They allow us to run queries, which is similar to a lot of recon frameworks. And I think that parallel is appropriate.
So what are they doing? Are they ripping through like registry and looking for keys, stuff like that?
Yeah, so the ability to enumerate the contents of the registry, registered services, running processes, the contents of directories, the ability to interact with other subsystems like the WMI subsystem to run queries. Very powerful capabilities. All of these solutions are free. But just be aware that if you allow WMI everywhere, if you allow PowerShell everywhere, when threat actors leverage those capabilities, you're going to have a bad time. I've talked about it before. I have a whole presentation on WMI forensics. The short version is there's not much.
What about something like Splunk, which is
Splunk, so I have a lot of feelings about aggregation, and I feel like Splunk is really a very nice framework, but maybe you can't afford Splunk. There's Elk Stack. I don't care where it goes. Put the data in one place and then develop processes that are repeatable, that are documented, everyone's cross-trained in. That's the most important step. Whatever the aggregation platform is, does not matter.
So a lot of this seems to play really well to enterprise-class networks. How do you see this applying to small businesses?
So small businesses have a real problem. And that's primarily that if you're under a certain size, typically you have like one operations person, but you don't have a security person. You don't have multiple security persons, but you also have a much smaller footprint. I've worked at a number of those smaller orgs, and the ability to interact with individual endpoints directly, if you've got 100 systems, well, some of these solutions cater to that. So GRR, very easy. There's also Awesome. You can use Cansa for Windows, and you can pull back logs to an elk stack instance that runs on virtual hardware. Like, these are things that take time to set up and develop expertise in, but they're not out of reach. They're not out of band. The real issue is that small businesses are actually pretty frequently targeted. I know organizations in the nonprofit space that are 20 to 30 people. Well, if you're involved in economic development in certain parts of the world, there are nations that want to know what you know, and they will do what they can to get into your environment. Now, the risk there is smaller because if you're not losing regulated data, if it doesn't financially impact you, you might not feel the motivation to take action. But some organizations feel like if they're compromised, the people they represent are also put at risk, and they take it very seriously. There are a couple of groups of folks that put material out. You've got SANS Top 20, you've got the ASD Top 35 that attempt to give some guidance. But from a technical implementation perspective, I think they really just need to own the process. And if you don't have at least one technical person, that's going to be a real challenge.
Yeah. All right.
So this is the third time during this conference that I've heard about interpreted scripts being used in malware. Are you aware of anything that can be like AV for interpreting?
No. So the problem with scripts is they're incredibly variable. Even if you just look at simple VB script or JScript, you can have compression, you can have string replacement, you can have encoding. Those combinations are not great because they're used legitimately in a number of different functions. So if you keyed off of just those attributes, you'd wind up blocking a lot of legitimate stuff. Additionally, most scripts are being used for an operational purpose, and the folks who are using those to support IT operations, they don't want to run the risk of breaking something. So it's very challenging. Some whitelisting solutions will allow you to say block all scripts outside of a certain directory, but not all of them offer that capability. So it's definitely something to consider with vendor selection, to focus on.